Great way to start a sermon, though. I'll tell you that. Good evening. Make sure everybody's on the same page. It is a good evening. It's a good time to be together. I'm glad you're here. Glad to be here with you this evening. It's a beautiful day outside. I'm not going to say that it's unfortunate that we aren't inside right now, or that we're not outside right now, that we're inside. I think we have a good reason to be in here or be here this evening, but we can acknowledge the beauty of His creation outside and the beauty of being together and seeing His creation in each other tonight. If you've got a copy of God's Word, I hope you have a copy handy. You might make your way to Hosea or Hosea or however you say his name. I'm not going to fight you about it. If you want to fight about it, go ahead. Find somebody else to fight with. But in Hosea, we find God sending the prophet Hosea a very broken-hearted message. Really from a prophet who becomes rather broken-hearted himself. It is beyond the look of tonight's sermon to look at those first three chapters, maybe chapter 3 primarily, where Hosea and Gomer have their relationship and its twists and turns, to put it very nicely and very shortly. And I'll leave that to you. We are going to read a portion of chapter 2 in a few minutes, but that we won't really have much time to focus there this evening. We mainly look at Hosea chapter 4 for our look here this evening. A few questions as we begin. Knowing God, and so that first question might come easily. Do you know God? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand because I don't know, that question is worthy of a hand raise. I think it might be too big, too deep of a question, that we might be too quick to trivially throw up our hands and say, yes, I know God. Just think about it for a moment. Do I know God? The question is not, do I know some things about God? Am I familiar and acquainted with the idea of God? Have I ever read the Bible? You could say yes to all those questions. Honestly, yes, and yet not know God. And then the next one, do you hear? You're filling out the handout, and I need to push a couple of buttons. All right. Okay. Do you hear God? Let's read the first part of the first verse of Hosea chapter 4. Hosea chapter 4, just the first half, that first sentence of the beginning of the chapter. Hosea says, hear, there's our word, hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel. For the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. Hear. Now, you might have an English version that makes it, I call it more instructive, where it says, listen to the word, or listen to the message of the Lord for His people Israel. And that word listen, I say it's more instructive because we, in our English, we use the word hear, and we might say, you heard me, but you didn't listen. You heard what I said. You might could even tell it back to me. You might have listened enough to do that, but you really didn't listen to me. Maybe it's when you tell a child to do something and they can tell you what you told them, but they didn't do it, so you say, you didn't listen, did you? Then again, there's a part of me that kind of likes the ESV and some of the others that says, hear the word of the Lord. There's something more, it's a more declaring statement, calling us to attention. And when you look at that word hear, you can find it a number of times throughout the Hebrew Bible. A good cross-reference. I didn't put it on the notes, but if you want to add it, go ahead. A good one would be Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Where there we are commanded to hear, O Israel. Hear. Because they understood this word as more inclusive than just hearing words reverberating off out of your ear, the sound waves. It was more that listen, pay attention, and then obey. Hear with the intent to do. Bring that back to Hosea chapter 4, verse 1. And then before we look at this further, look at the rest of that first statement. Do you hear? Here's part of why they needed to hear, and part of why we as God's people today might need to hear if we're not careful. Is God says, I have a lawsuit against you. Got a controversy is how it's translated in this English text. But it is based on the covenant that they have with God, the covenant that you and I, if we're Christians, have with God through Jesus, that says, I have agreed to some terms. And now God writes to them, God writes to us, and says, to paraphrase, you are in breach of contract. What do you do if God brings you into the courtroom of the universe, calls heaven and earth to witness against you, and says, I've got a case, a legal case against you? That's why those two questions matter. Do I know God? Do I hear God? And so as we look at the rest of this chapter, I believe we see at least these three things in Hosea 4, the rest of verse 1 through the rest of the chapter. And we're going to highlight some of this for the sake of efficiency of study. We see an absence. Something's missing. We see presence in its place. Something is present. And then there is the consequence, or consequences even, of the first two. The absence, the presence leads, really each one leads to the other, from 1, 2, and 3, consequence. Let's look at it. Hosea chapter 4. I suppose we should say Hosea 4, 1b, the second part now of verse 1, absence. As we keep reading Hosea, we find that much of, or really almost all of the rest of this oracle, this prophetic document, is written in poetic style. Depending on the typography, the setup of your English Bible, you may have it broken down that way. If you have your Bible and it's in paragraph format, it's probably not for most of Hosea. The one I've got, it is verse by verse, letting you know, hey, this is poetry. Just like you'll find in the Psalms, the Proverbs, much of Ecclesiastes. And that to me is an ironic combo, or at least an interesting combo, that Hosea is a legal case from God, but it's not written in legalese. It's mostly written in poetry. When have you ever heard a judge issue his sentence and he wrote it as a poem? Probably not. Maybe you've heard it. I haven't. I mean, you might find a lawyer that uses a little poetry in maybe one of his statements, but that's pushing it. But God, when He brings His case, says, I'm going to write it to you, or He does write it to us in poetry. Well, what does the poetry say? Let's read the rest of verse 1 now. The absence. He says, there is no. That's why I said it's absent. Something is missing. No faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land. God has a legal case against the inhabitants of the land. Why? Well, if you're looking at this as a legal brief, item A is there is no, those three in this land. There's no faithfulness. And there's no other words attached or connected directly to faithfulness here. Is this faithfulness to their God, to our God? If God are writing this to us today as the church, or to this nation, or to any nation, is it faithfulness to one another? And all these tend to go hand in hand, don't they? My faithfulness to God, and whether that's in my life in general, whether that is, say, we tend to isolate it or break it down to just go into a church building frequently, and that's faithful or unfaithful. It's more than that, but it is that. And then that leads to the way I treat people. What about faithfulness to your spouse? What would it look like? What would happen if in our world today you inserted that quality? People that are faithful, people that are loyal to God, to their wife, or husband, to their children, to their friends, to their brothers and sisters in Jesus, to their employee, their employer. How would that change our society? If, say, you could snap your fingers and overnight, maybe not even everybody, but most everybody, let's say 75% of the population instantly became faithful people. I think it might change a whole lot. Faithfulness. And then steadfast love. This loyalty here, there's some English text that translate steadfast love as loyalty. I think these words are related, to say the least. Two words that come to mind for me is unbroken and devotion. Not that I'm not saying steadfast love don't work, but we hear that a lot. We sing it. I wonder if we become too acquainted with it sometimes. It's an unbroken devotion. It's the kind of love that God has toward us that never fails, that's new every morning, but that's missing here. Now, as you look at these two terms, it is the two terms, same two terms, or they are the same two terms that God uses to describe himself. When Moses wants to see God in Exodus 34, it's an example of when God reveals himself in a greater way. In Exodus 34, verse 6, he reveals himself with these two qualities, among some others. The two that are mentioned almost in exact parallel to Hosea 4:1 is faithfulness and steadfast love. But God looks, if we were to keep putting ourselves in these shoes, God looks down at us and says, something's wrong here. We ever do that? Look at a situation and go, something's wrong. We might not know. God knows what's wrong. We might not know. We might just say that. Something's not there that should be there. They've lost something. Have we lost something? Faithfulness, steadfast love. The third one he lists here is the knowledge of God. Does that mean that people didn't know the law of God? At this point in Israel's history, things are pretty chaotic. They had went through 6 kings. In Hosea's day, they go through 6 kings in 24 years. 4 out of the 6 are executed by their successors. The 5th is captured in battle. Rough times politically. We're getting more of the ethical, moral side, the spiritual side. This is northern Israel. They don't have the temple in Jerusalem. They have idols set up. 2 big locations for worship. They have a farce priesthood. They don't have even real priests at all. There might be something to the fact that they weren't learning the law, but it may be deeper than that. It may be not just that they didn't know intellectually, it may even be that some of them did. That if you went up to them and asked them, is it wrong to be unfaithful to God? What would they say? Might have said, well, of course. Because another word for knowledge is acknowledge. Acknowledgement. The New English translation uses that actually. It says, there is no acknowledgement of God in the land. It isn't that they can't quote the 10 Commandments. It is that they don't abide by the 10 Commandments. It's in there, but it's not really there. They've pushed it away. They've covered their ears and their eyes. They don't want to know what God says. And so they don't live acknowledging this is who God is. This is what God says. Now, we think of acknowledgement, in my experience, we sometimes limit it to just noticing something someone does for us. You acknowledge their good deed, their help, and you might send them a thank you card, or you at least say something verbally to express, hey, I've noticed what you've done. I acknowledged you. That would be part of this, giving thanks to God. But that's maybe one small piece of the whole puzzle. Let's stay in Hosea for just a moment. Look at Hosea chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. Let's trace some of the way this word know is used. It's used more than what we have in these verses in Hosea. It's used even back in chapter 2, for example. But here's a few samples. Hosea 5, verses 3 and 4. He says, I know. Same word. Different grammatical form, of course. I know Ephraim, a chief tribe for these 10 northern tribes. And Israel is not hidden from me. For now, O Ephraim, you have played the whore. Israel is defiled. Their deeds do not permit them to return to their God, for the spirit of whoredom is within them, and they know not the Lord. Or as we would say a little less poetically, they do not know. They don't know the Lord. Have they completely forgotten about Him? I don't think so. They didn't have a close, walking, knowing, acknowledging relationship. I know sometimes that word has a bad taste. I think it works here. They didn't know Him like that. Then look at chapter 6, verse 6. Page or so over. This one might ring a bell in your ears. He says, for I desire steadfast love, there's that one, and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Part of what we see here is the parallel between steadfast love, unbroken devotion, and knowledge or acknowledgement of God. If we're relying on the poetic form here, those two are placed as parallels or even synonyms for each other. If you don't love like this, do you know God? Put down Mark chapter 12 as a reference to consider on your own, if you're a mind to, because Jesus answers the question there about the greatest commandments as to love God, right? And love who? Your neighbor as yourself. Two greatest commandments. And then the person asking Jesus, and the text indicates he's correct, he connects that to this, to Hosea 6:6. He says, yeah, that's right, because God says, what I really want isn't your sacrifices, it's your steadfast love and your knowledge of me. So this loving God, loving people, steadfast love then, faithfulness, and knowing God, they're all in the same box. That's what's missing. In Hosea 8, 1 through 3, God says this, or they say this, and we'll notice what God says in the context. God says, set the trumpet, this is Hosea 8:1, to your lips. One quick parenthetical here. Something you can do also in your own time, if you're a mind to as well, is look at the beginning of each chapter. Almost all of them. Chapter 7 is really carried over from chapter 6. But 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, almost every, in the way that it's broken down into chapters, fits the poetry, they all start with these exclamations. Hear the word of the Lord, chapter 4. Set the trumpets to your lips now. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord. If you like word pictures, Hosea is filled with them. because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. To me they cry, my God, we, what does your Bible say there? Yeah, we know you. We're here on a Sunday night. This is the Sunday night crowd preaching to the choir. That's how we say it. If there is a way to say, publicly express verbally with presence and words as we sing, as we pray, as somebody preaches, if there is a way for us to publicly say to God, at least to others, we know God, this might be a pretty good way. Some of them were at least still saying, we know you. But they didn't. Look at verse 3. Israel has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue them, or him. That overlaps with something else in just a moment. That's a few other ways this word knowledge or know is used in Hosea. Before we look at these last two, and the last two will be more overview because of the way they flow out of this first one. Let's turn away from Hosea for one moment to Romans. The first chapter of Romans, the letter that the Holy Spirit inspired the Apostle Paul to pen to the Christians in ancient Rome. And as he begins his letter, he describes the nations and their rejection as a whole of God. Look at these three verses, 21 through 23 of Romans chapter 1. It says, although, and I hit a button or something. I don't know what happened there. Okay. Romans 1:21. For although they knew God, and there I think it is more, they knew about him. They knew he existed. Because look at what the rest of it says. Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God. Or could we say, with our purpose tonight, they did not acknowledge him as God. And it says, or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, and birds, and animals, and creeping things. They knew about God. They knew better. Israel knew better even more than the nations did. And although they might not have as boldly rejected God, maybe they did, depending on how you want to count boldly, their rejection of God led to the acceptance of idolatry in Romans 1. Like the nations, like Israel. And I'm afraid if we aren't knowing and hearing God like the nations, so Israel of today. Absence. Is there something missing, church? Go back to Hosea chapter 4 and look at what happens next. The presence. This one is just one verse, Hosea chapter 4, verse 2. It's still a part of the sentence if you're looking at it that way. So, hear the word of the Lord, legal case, there is no absence. There is presence, swearing, lying. And so swearing, you shall not take the name of your Lord your God in vain. And that's just how we talk in our society, isn't it? That's how we speak. It's how we write. It's how we text. Although if it's in text or on social media, it usually just gets turned into the acronym OMG. Or we try and soften it. And we'll say, oh my gosh. Or instead of Jesus Christ, fill in some other words. And then lying, you shall not bear false witness. You could open up Hosea 4, and with another Bible or hold your place, you could read Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5, the 10 Commandments. That's what he's telling them. You're breaking these that I gave you. Breach of covenant. Murder. I saw today where a former director of Planned Parenthood who was under investigation for child porn committed suicide. There's murder in the land. Stealing. I also saw recently where one of the organizations, I guess it's the main company in New York City that runs the buses and the subways, they lose about $500 million, didn't say million, $1 billion to people skipping through, not paying for their fares. There's that video where people go through the exit, the emergency exit, and then they hold the door open for other people to come through. Stealing. There is, and committing adultery. And then this line, we're gonna bring these together. It says they break all bounds or bonds. This is like they go out of bounds, the boundaries set, or they're chained up and they break the restraints. It's a word that physically means that, but I don't know that that's, in this context, it seems to be more about ethical bonds. We called it, in the history of our country, we called it the sexual revolution. Freedom. Who doesn't love freedom? It's the old school religious people that want to restrict you, bind you up. They don't want you to enjoy life. It's your body. Do what you want. And we are still reaping the fruits of that revolution. Do you realize the lawsuits that are starting to happen? We're a few years past the UK, but it's starting here. Because of the repercussions of surgeries. And there are people in public standing up and saying that children do not need the consent of their parents to mutilate their own bodies. Now, I'm not saying that parents should be letting them anyway. That's just keeping a finger on the pulse of our culture. And if we don't think it's seeping in to the Lord's church, we might need to think again. Freedom. Or at least that's the term used. Let's get the rest of this verse, and then we have to move on. It says, they break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. One way of imagining visually in your mind this, or even if you were to put it into a picture, and I didn't do that, it's like he's saying in Israel, when someone is killed, or at least they're attacked violently, their blood is spilled, and then the next one happens, and blood is on blood. It's just one violent crime after another. It just keeps on going and increasing. You could take, if we wanted to, you could look at the statistics. Look at what happened in 2020. When people weren't able to work, when more people were home. Look at the violence that occurred. But then let's not miss this. The reason for these things, the reason that these things are present in a culture, in a society, in a people, is because the first three in verse 1 are absent. You take faithfulness and steadfast love because you know God away, and then this is just what happens. Go back to the text, and let's do some reading. We now see the consequence The present is a consequence, but here's the final consequence. Hosea 4, 3 through 6. You can compare Deuteronomy and the covenant curses. Remember, God says, you've broken my covenant. I told you this would happen. Hosea 4, verse 3, therefore the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish, and also the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. Yet, let no one contend, and let none accuse, for with you is my contention, O priest. And you can, even in reading English text, you can notice there is a textual disagreement here. That's for another occasion, but be aware of that. You shall stumble by day, verse 5 says, the prophet also shall stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother, or because of your actions you destroy your own mother. And then verse 6, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Draw that line back to verse 1. They don't know me, they're going to be destroyed. The people who don't know their God do not last. Because you've rejected knowledge, see that again, they've intentionally pushed it from them. I reject you from being a priest to me. By the way, the leadership is mentioned at least 5 times in just this chapter alone. And they're not mentioned positively in any of those times. Since you have forgotten the law, verse 6 goes on to say, of your God, I will forget also your children. Consequence of the absence that causes the presence is not anything pretty. And then 7 through 12 as we close. The more they increased, the more they sinned against me. I will change their glory, what they boast in, what they take pride in, against them, into shame. They feed on the sin of my people, their sacrifices. It's possible that he's saying the priests were excited that people were sinning more and decided to bring more sacrifices as to cover their sin, because that meant they got more. It's one possible meaning of that. They were feeding on the sins of my people, and they're greedy for their iniquity. It shall be like people, like priests. I will punish them for their ways. Verse 9 goes on to say, and repay them for their deeds. They shall eat, but not be satisfied. They shall play the whore, but not multiply. Part of the more immediate consequence of this kind of behavior, this idolatry, is that activities like eating food and sex, they don't have their true meaning anymore when I leave God. Verse 11, or the rest of verse 10, because they have forsaken the Lord to cherish whoredom, wine, and new wine, which take away the understanding. Because of that, he says, verse 12, my people inquire of a piece of wood, and their walking staff gives them oracles. For a spirit of whoredom has led them astray. In here, I believe that whoredom is not specific sexual sins, although it's involved. It is their spiritual adultery, idolatry. And then the last line of verse 12. He says, they do these things by the spirit of whoredom that has led them astray, and they have left their God to play the whore. We could take that last line of verse 12 and put that under consequence. Even though that's a part of all of it, both absence, presence, that's the final epitaph of a people like this, is they have left God. They've made the secondary primary idolatry. In Hosea chapter 4, we see an absence of things like faithfulness, knowing God. We see a presence that replaces it. When the vacuum is there, it will not stay a vacuum for long. And it replaces it with things like lies, sexual immorality, murder, and freedom. And the consequence is destruction, dissatisfaction, and shame. Not necessarily in that order, but that's the idea. Do you know God? Do you hear God? Ignorance is when something is missing, almost like that absent. You just don't know. Some people don't know. I'm not sure that's true of most people. This kind of lack of knowledge in Hosea 4 is more positive. There's something at work where I am directly rebelling and resisting and rejecting the knowledge of God. But to those like that, in that same book, there's a promise. We'll read two passages, and then Gary will lead us in a song of invitation. Hosea chapter 2, should be up there, okay. Verses 16, I think it says 15, but that's a typo. Verses 16 through 23, a promise. And then without comment from me, we'll read chapter 6, 1 through 3, a challenge. Hosea 2, 16. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they shall be remembered by name no more. I will make for them a covenant on that day with the beasts of the field, birds of the heavens, and the creeping things of the ground. And I will abolish the bow, the sword, and the war from the land, and I will make you lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. And in that day I will answer, declares the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth, and the earth shall answer the grain and the wine and the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. And I will sow her for myself in the land. And I will have mercy on no mercy. And I will say to not my people, you are my people. He shall say, you are my God. Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us that he may heal us. He has struck us down that he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. Let us know. Let us press on to know the Lord. His going out is sure as the dawn. He will come to us as the showers, as the spring rains that water the earth. Let's stand and sing together.